Okay, we're recording.
All right.
Wow, Paola, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Well, first I'll introduce you to everyone, but everyone who is listening needs to know that Paola and I have previously, well, we're friends. Paola works with my wife, but we're friends and have had this discussion already last week, and my computer lost our entire conversation. So Paola has been gracious enough to give us another hour of her time, and I'm so grateful to you for that.
Nothing.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So Paola is Paola Salwan Daher is awesome, and is a Marxist feminist activist and writer from Lebanon, Senior Global Advocacy Advisor at the Center for Reproductive Rights, and co-founder of the very, very rad feminist radio, Hammam Radio. Thank you so much for being with us today, Paola. I'm so grateful. So like all of the other conversations, this has been a collaborative effort. So Paola and I, over a couple of weeks, talked about how we wanted the arc of the conversation to happen. And we thought that starting out with some definitions would be super useful, because there's a wide variety of kind of knowledge base of people who are listening to these conversations. And the three definitions that Paola is going to talk about as an expert is what intersectionality is, what radical Marxist feminism is, and what social reproduction theory is. And then after we've kind of set the groundwork, we'll talk about two notions specifically that'll weave in and out a bunch of other things, but analyzing the gendered impact of COVID-19 inside and outside of the domestic sectors. And we'll spend some time breaking out what that actually means. What are the different sectors that are represented in that? And then we'll also discuss the necessity of feminism of the 99%, and that advocates for recognition, compensation, and in particular collectivization of reproductive work. And this conversation feels like it's becomes more and more vital as every week goes by. So I am so glad to have you, and let's just get into it, shall we?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Casey, for having me and for also taking another hour out of your time to re-record this interview. And I will start with a small definition of intersectionality. And I think I want to say first off that intersectionality is a concept that we owe to Black feminists. And I think that within the context of what is happening in the US now with the Black Lives Matter social movement, and with the rise of the people against police brutality, and also the other underlying patterns of structural racism and discrimination that we are seeing in the US, the impact and the amount of work that Black feminisms have done and have given to us, other feminists of color and feminists at large, cannot be emphasized enough. We owe a tremendous debt to Black social movements, to reproductive justice movement, social justice movement, and to Black feminists for giving us intersectionality.
We're deeply indebted.
Yes, and I kind of just wanted to reposition as intersectionality is becoming depoliticized and is becoming whitewashed in a way. I think that it's really important to remember where it came from and how it was used. And it originated with Black feminists. And the Black feminist scholar who coined the term was Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, and she first framed it as a legal theory concept. So she came from a background of critical racial studies, and her colleagues were actually criticizing the way that the law in the US was being applied to Black women, and to Black people in general, but more particularly to Black women. It seemed that, racist oppression and racism were seen as aberration within the law, and they were not seen as completely linked to the underlying structural patterns of racism that plague and that still plague the society. And so in her work on 3 cases, particularly, she kind of examined how US courts either litigated those cases considering Black women just as Black under the oppression of basically racism, or just as women, but not really linking the two, therefore missing the intersection of forms of oppression that directly impacted these women, and directly impacted their case, and directly impacted their relationships to society at large. And so it's a study. Intersectionality is kind of a study of the interconnectedness of different patterns of discrimination and oppression, and it's how these different patterns apply and impact a person and their relationship, and how these different power dynamics impact their relationship to society at large. And so, from this legal theory concept that Crenshaw coined, there's also a very deeply political origin to intersectionality. It also originated with Black feminists such as Angela Davis and Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks and others, who were actually Black women who were very active in anti-racist movements, but also as feminists. And within the feminist movement, it was only the experiences of white bourgeois or middle class women that were being centered, and in anti-racist movements, it was mostly, feminist issues were completely overlooked.
Right.
And so intersectionality also was used as a political practice and a political tool to recenter the issues of Black women, as being women at the intersection of gender, race, and class. Mm-hmm. And then it was broadened to sexual orientation, gender identity, ability, and legal status, and other forms of oppression. But I think that it's this dual relationship, this dual origin of intersectionality that is really interesting. It's how it manifests, in law and as a legal concept, but also as political practice.
And I think, one of the things that I just want to add, particularly given the manifestations of everything that's happening today. So we're March 31st, 2020. And I think for people who are having a hard time being like, okay, intersectionality, what does that mean? It's the intersection of different forms of oppression, like Paola said, but that definition distances us from the conversation about what is oppressing all of those, kind of what is the system that oppression lies under. And I think that it's important for us to remember that this in the United States. So I'm French, Paola is Lebanese, so we're living in Europe. So we have a more global relationship to this. But here in the United States, this country was built on the premise that the sole beneficiary of all institutional infrastructure was a white, cisgendered, heterosexual man. And anyone who existed outside of that, was oppressed by the system, because the system was made to elevate, benefit, and protect only that person, a white cisgendered man. And so what has happened is this conversation of intersectionality that we are indebted to so many Black activists, feminist Black activists and scholars, and having that lens put on to everyone's eyes so that it can be applied not only here in the United States, but around the world. And that is a deeply impactful and powerful contribution. So the next thing based on that, right, is this notion of radical Marxist feminism. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So Marxist feminism is a branch of Marxism, if I can put it this way. I often laugh when I even hear myself describe myself as a Marxist feminist, because it's a terminology I think that less and less though, but it's a way of characterizing yourself that is not very common. We are not a whole bunch of Marxist feminists, but I think that our numbers are growing, and we're seen as maybe traitors because of a lot of high levels of sexism that exist in Marxist political parties. And so Marxist feminism is basically a current that uses Marxist concepts such as class, such as reification, such as social totality, power dynamics, but also refuses the economic reductionism that characterizes a lot of Marxist movements, that really centers the conversation around class oppression and around capitalism kind of being the mother of all types of oppression, and really centers also gender feminist issues really in the context of Marxism. And so for instance, reproductive work is really important to Marxist feminists, and social reproduction theory is also very important to Marxist feminists. It is how the mechanisms of gender-based discrimination and oppression based on gender intersect with class exploitation.
Right.
And so this is, and we are also very close to queer Marxism, for instance, which is also another current that draws from feminist Marxism, but also uses Marxist theory and also Marxist concepts to look at oppressions based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and refuses this over-emphasis and this kind of hierarchy of oppression. And it created a lot of conversations within Marxist circles, because a lot of, obviously, cisgendered men tend to see capitalism really as the mother of all oppressions, and that when you fix capitalism and you dismantle it, then other systems of oppression will miraculously stop existing, which is not reality, it's not the truth.
No. So it's like, get rid of capitalism,
exactly,
patriarchy, don't worry about it.
But it's also a way, so Marxist feminism is also a way to bring the conversation around class oppression and class exploitation in feminist circles. So because it's also a form of oppression, and capitalism is often overlooked, especially in mainstream feminism. And there's a tendency, and we will talk about that a bit later on in the conversation, there's also a tendency to want to just have more women in existing systems of oppression, and have more women as CEOs and more women participating actively in capitalist ventures, rather than actually questioning the impact that capitalism has on women and girls. So it's kind of trying to fight with everyone. It's a very nice place to be. You have a lot of
that. I am okay with that. I mean, I have a friend, Eileen Miles, who is this, fucking rad poet. She, was a dyke fucking before it was cool to be a fucking dyke. She came up in the East Village. She's, I don't know, in her 70s, butch as fuck, and is like, look, I'm fine with the fact that many problems meet here. And what she meant was her body. Hello. Coucou.
Tu dis bonjour à Casey. See, this is social reproduction.
Bonjour, ça va?
Oui.
Ouais, tout va bien? T'as passé une bonne journée?
Passé une bonne journée?
Ouais.
J'ai pas aller dans la piscine.
Ah, non, pas encore. Pas encore. Mais un jour, tu vas pouvoir retourner à la piscine, ça c'est sûr. Mais pas encore. Bah, parce que, tu sais, faut faire attention encore. Mais peut-être que tu vas pouvoir aller à un lac.
Ça. Tu vas voir grandma? Après, tu me dis, ok?
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Oh my God, are you kidding? Like, and fucking topical.
And point. Case in point.
And
see?
Marxist
feminism. Exactly.
I mean, now, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk about social reproduction theory.
So social reproduction theory is a Marxist feminist concept that looks at what constitutes labor and what is considered as labor. And it's not just basically compensated labor, but it also looks at that kind of labor that is not recognized, that is undervalued, that is not compensated, such as reproductive work, for instance. Exactly, and that type of work that has been considered women's work, and because it has been considered women's work, it also participated into the gender stereotype linked to, it's not work that needs to be valued. And then there was the creation of that myth that women are naturally caring and that we're naturally very, at ease with doing that type of work. And so social reproduction work kind of tries to dismantle these stereotypes that pertain to women, as if we were born to do that work, where we're absolutely not. It's
Right.
something that still very disproportionately impact women, is actually a burden on women. And the fact that we are meant to feel a certain type of way about that work, about reproductive work, is also a problem. It's also very it's trying to guilt women into enjoying that work, and if you don't enjoy it,
Right.
without compensation, it's supposed to be a labor of love, right? And sometimes it is, but most of the time it's fucking tedious.
Yeah.
And so it's about deconstructing these stereotypes while trying to really value that type of labor, but also trying to deconstruct the fact that it's supposed to be women's labor, and try and have it recognized and valued. And social reproduction theory also looks at the relationship that capitalism has with reproductive work. And it has a very fraught relationship, as in capitalism cannot survive without reproductive work, obviously, because it's work that participates into perpetrating the workforce. And capitalism, needs obviously workforce, and it needs a workforce that is in good health to some extent, that is exploitable. So, and you can't be exploitable if you're dying.
Right.
So, but it doesn't want to invest, capitalism really, and neoliberal policies do not want to invest in health, do not want to invest in education, do not want to invest in building that healthy workforce that is educated and can actually question capitalism. Hence comes that, the fact that this labor is not considered labor, it's not recognized, not valued, and the budgets that are devoted to education and health, for instance, and culture are kept to a minimum.
Yeah,
and
also and they're also the first things that go.
Exactly. Exactly. And as we have seen with the COVID-19 crisis, it's the first thing that go, and it's also the first things that become privatized. It's the first thing that become for profit as well, because it tries to kind of get back a bit of profit that it's that as it thinks it has forgone. So there's this trend to privatize everything instead of making them public goods, because they're human rights, basically, right to health. Right, and so is the right to education. And so that is kind of what social reproduction theory is attached to, is trying to really analyze the relationship between capitalism and reproductive work, and really dismantle the stereotypes that are attached to that type of work.
Do you think that now is a good time for us to talk specifically about how this is kind of taking the lens of social reproductive theory and Marxist feminism and intersectionality, discussing the gendered impact of COVID-19 inside and outside the domestic sectors? Is that okay? So can we just break down very quickly? So domestic can feel like a very I'm really thinking a lot about polite words, like how our words sometimes become they're so polite and they are so far away from what we mean. So domestic is anything that has to do with a home. That is, when you think about any homes across all over the world, inside the home, children, parents, the parents of parents, cleaning, washing, electricity, not electricity, sweeping the front porch, vacuuming, that is what we mean when we're talking about it's like the domestic sector. It's like that feels like such a, it's a very precise word, but it is so far removed from kind of like the massiveness of it, right? So let's talk about the gendered impact of COVID-19 inside the domestic sector.
The first thing that comes to mind is, and this is something that the media have actually devoted a lot of attention to without necessarily doing anything about it, of the public authorities not doing anything about it, is the increase of violence against women, but also against children, and also against members of LGBTIQ communities, including young people. And so we have seen, for instance, in France, I think the last statistics that I've seen was an increase, like 30% increase in rates of violence. And that is kind of one of the primary gendered impact of COVID-19 related measures, such as confinement. And for me, it's interesting because people are saying that this is a result of the confinement because of COVID. And to me, it's not really accurate, as in, it's not because there's a pandemic that, people are, men basically are more stressed, and this is why they're losing it more easily on children and on women. It's kind of a cop-out. I think that interpretation completely overlooks the fact that we live in the patriarchal society. Pretty much anywhere that we live in the patriarchal society that sustains rape culture, that sustains and encourages, because really there's total impunity for cases of violence against women. And so a lot of, it's true that being able to go out to work provides kind of a relief for women who live in violent households. But I think that what the crisis is forcing us to do is really question the family. It's really question the heteronormative patriarchal bourgeois family that we are being sold as the main unit of society that is supposed to provide comfort and nurturing and solidarity, where most of the cases, the cases of violence against women, children, and queer people is within the so-called family. And so I think that there is definitely a need to review and to dismantle completely, honestly, the institution of the family. And so it has, so the first kind of impact is a very dire one, because it's cases of accrued violence. And it also has highlighted the complete inertia of states and governments, because they have realized that we do not have enough shelters for women who are facing situations of violence, who would like to live with their family. We do not have a proper infrastructure to really support these women and really support these young people who might be in need of leaving their house. And so we are forcing them de facto in staying, because it's a very, when you're a mother, for instance, and you have children and you have nowhere else to go and you have no support system, and the shelters tell you we're full, we can't accept you, so what do? Do you take your children and go on the streets? Some women do it, some women won't do it. And no one is to blame in any case. It's kind of a desperate situation, but it is the responsibility of governments to do something about that, and no one was prepared, because obviously it's more important to devote money to defense budgets and internal security and surveillance budget, rather than actually spend money in meaningful policies against violence against women. So that is kind of one aspect. The other aspect is women doing a lot more of reproductive work. And so women have found themselves, and now we're going to see a whole bunch of studies coming out. I think that one of the studies that I was reading, that I mentioned the last time, that really stayed with me, is the amount of academic production that women scholars were able to put out, and they were writing less during the confinement period, and their male counterparts just kept publishing and publishing, because they were home, and apparently they had they had time. So it seems that with the studies that are coming out, that men are doing a bit more reproductive work, but the burden on women has exploded.
Mm.
And women have been forced to, juggle Zoom conferences with childcare, with everything that needs to be done within the home, with trying to, keep afloat a house, and, trying to homeschool. And this is something that I've personally lived as well,
Yeah, of
and
course.
it is just, you end up at the end of the day, you're like, it's 1:00 in the morning, and have you done one thing well? And you haven't. And it's just because that work has always been conceptualized as being women's work.
Right.
And so during the confinement, it just highlighted the inequalities
Yeah.
between men and women.
And it's also not just been kind of highlighted or explained as women's work, but it's been kind of under this presumption of enjoyment. That's enjoyment, but also easiness of it. That somehow, which, I appreciate the presumption of the superpower of women being able to, and this, exactly, like of women somehow being able to educate, care, love for, and feed their children, their spouses, their parents, if their parents are living with them, and also be able to, with great ease, comfort, joy, and inspiration, carry on with their careers, have the clarity and rest of insightful thinking. And I just am like, I love that you guys think so much of women, but the impossibility of that is phenomenal. And it reminds me of, well, there are two things that I want to say. So I was in a physically abusive relationship, and as a queer, violent, it became physically violent. And as a queer person, we also know firsthand what it means to be ejected from your home. Like you are rejected, ejected. And that's why 70% of homeless youth in New York City, for example, is queer. Like that is a statistic that has not changed, that has not moved at all, even with gay marriage happening. Like it just institutionally, that is something the queers just get immediately rejected from the families. But when I finally chose to leave, it was one morning, I had a packed bag with my passport, I'd hidden the bag, I left before she woke up, and I had to go and get professional help with someone who understood exactly what it was to be someone who was a victim of domestic violence. Because when I came to her, I said, well, she was, she didn't have a great childhood. And she said, you know what, listen to me. This is something that happens a lot with military wives, right? Their husbands come home and they lose their fucking shit. And the first thing that we have to tell them is that if it was, this happens, therefore I'm gonna beat up my wife, then every single person who has suffered some sort of traumatic experience would be beating up their spouse. And that simply is not the case. And so she stared at me, and there was silence in the room, and she said, she hits you because she wants to. And I was like, okay. Like, because she thinks she can. Because that is
it's a control thing.
It's a control thing. And so I just want to say, like, if there's anyone out there kind of who's listening to these statistics, and we've seen them as COVID-19 and the studies are coming in, that like very strange things have happened. Like, here in the United States, the childcare system was able to submit data finally that showed that any sort of calls around the welfare and well-being of children had dropped by 30%. And that doesn't mean that violence against children has stopped. What that means is that the institutions that can sometimes help and protect the vulnerable were closed.
Yeah.
So parents, sports teams, anything where another adult might be able to see what's happening to a small child had disappeared. So 30% of those calls decreased. And so we're seeing kind of in inverse the data that's happening around domestic violence. It's like that domestic violence has gone increased, not because suddenly men can't handle their stress, but it's because there is this, like, it's hidden behind women having the ability to go to work, right? It's hidden behind the ability of women to be able to leave the home, right? And now suddenly it's like that is not happening, and therefore the conflicts remain, but they were always there. So one of the horrible things that's happening is that COVID-19 is giving us the data. It's giving us an impossibility to not see.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is unfortunate that it's taken something like this for us, for the data to help people who were comfortably unseeing these things to not be able to anymore.
I love what you said about, women being super women, and being, women can do everything and anything, and it's another way of guilt tripping us, because then if you don't enjoy doing it, or you can't do it all, then what, you're not a superwoman, and
something's wrong with you.
Something's wrong with you. But I wish women were afforded the luxury and privilege to be considered human in just the way that white cisgendered straight men are. I just want to be considered a human. I don't need to be. I don't want to be a superhero. I'm not.
Can we talk a little bit about what you talked about last time, which was this notion of hero and your issues with it, which I have not stopped thinking about it.
So, and that touches upon the impact of the pandemic on women outside the confines of the home. And so we know that women represent the majority of the health and care workforce, that we're disproportionately affected because we're disproportionately on the front lines. And this myth, again, that has been created around, these people, these healthcare workers, this dichotomy between essential workers and non-essential workers is also another ploy devised by capitalism to divide workers. So all workers are essential. But this myth that has been created, people working on the front lines as if they are heroes and we need to applaud them. And of course, we need to celebrate them for the work that they're
Paola,
cognizant. Can you hear me?
Yeah, the internet is going in and out, and so I just want to let me just make sure that everyone in my home. So we are all 4 adults working from home, and we're having to collectively work on the one internet réseau. So just give me
sure.
One quick second. Okay, there, I think we should be good. Okay, go ahead. So, heroes, okay.
So, and again, like I have huge issues with that terminology of heroes, because it really kind of takes away the responsibility of the government. When you're a hero, you're not a regular worker. And so the things that I kept, like, even every time that I kept hearing heroes, I kept answering workers, not heroes.
Right.
Because a hero is like something that is someone that is operating out of the realm of being just human, again, or just being a worker, and what they are doing is seen as something that is completely amazing, that is something that people could not do when they're providing a service like that. They're not regular workers, and so therefore they are not to be awarded the same kind of rights and entitlements that workers should be awarded.
Right.
And so there was also a lot of reactions from healthcare workers saying, it's great that you're clapping for us, but maybe next time vote for a government that will not defund chronically public health services, and that will pay us more than a pittance, and that will make sure that we have access to PPE, and will make sure that we have access to the gear that we need to have access to, and make sure that we do not become a privatized venture, a for-profit industry, where actually every case is counted per the profit that it can bring, without the well-being of the worker and the patient at heart. And so I feel of the hero was created by government because it's a way of distancing the whole issue from the conversation around workers' rights, because the powers that be really know that when it becomes a conversation around the impact of capitalism and neoliberal policies on workers and on healthcare workers, then people will start holding them accountable.
Right.
So when you stop talking about heroes and you start talking about workers and the amount of healthcare workers who have died, many of them because they couldn't have access to the gear that they needed to, or because their working conditions were so horrid that they just couldn't protect themselves, then it creates accountability.
Right.
And so I think that we need to create that accountability. We need, when this is, and people are like, when this is all over, well, it might not be over. So we need to ask the questions now. We need to ask the questions, what have you done to public hospitals? What have you done to the public health systems? Not just in terms of who can have access to health, which is an entirely valid question that really needs to be asked, because this crisis has really highlighted exactly in hyper-capitalist societies like the US, for instance, and who was able to access care. And also who is walking around with underlying conditions that they don't know about because they can't go and get checked because it's so expensive and they have no health insurance as workers. So it really needs to be a and its impact on all workers, and because they were disproportionately affected, its impact on healthcare workers, and also on women who participate in the care economy in a disproportionate way. And so these women who, as you were saying, like take care of their immediate family, but also take care of older people. Sometimes they're compensated for it, other times they're not. And so, this is kind of the issue that I had with the whole hero terminology. And it's not to say that, in any way undermining or minimizing the work that they have been doing. On the contrary, I want that work to be valued and to be recognized so that they never find themselves in that situation ever again.
And I think that's this idea of hero also creates this, again, it creates this inevitability of either death or disappearance, right? You've either died a hero, or the issue has been resolved and you get to fly away into the sunset. In both instances, the government doesn't have to, or any sort of institution doesn't have, it absents them from any sort of responsibility. And I think that we're seeing that, one of my friends is a doctor in Australia. His salary actually, it's a public healthcare system in Australia. So it's a very different, when I talk about a doctor's salary in Australia, it's very different than what it means to have a doctor's salary in the United States. But he was a first-year doctor, and he got his salary lowered in the middle of the pandemic. And then we also see, kind of Amazon workers here in the United States, or Whole Foods market workers, they were given, $3 extra during the pandemic, or $2 extra. And I'm just like, $2 extra, $3 extra, that's nothing. That is nothing. I mean, anyone who earns so that is the equivalent of $18 an hour, right? That's $15 is the minimum wage, which does not mean livable wage here in the United States. $3 above that is $18 an hour. And that somehow gets translated into this acceptable, celebration of workers within this capitalist environment is insane. And that it has a time limit, that extra $3 or that extra $2, and you should be lucky that we're even giving you that money. By the way, come June, we're taking it away because COVID's over. So that hero that we've clapped, thank you for bringing us our stuff, for putting yourself at risk or whatever. We're going to put you back down at a wage that actually doesn't allow for you to do anything. So it's
the whole narrative around us being at war with COVID. I think that the really highly toxic masculinity type of very highly militaristic language that is being used is also it's a strategy also to make you feel that who are the soldiers that we are sending to the front lines. It's the healthcare soldiers. And so exactly it goes back to what you were saying, like if they die, well, it is a war, and in a war, people die. And that completely negates the conversation that needs to happen around, well, these people actually didn't need to die. It's not a war against a virus. It's actually a pandemic that needs to have a global health/human rights response that you are not able to provide because you don't want to, because you want the workers also to still put themselves at risk so that Amazon can keep, making billions. Because you still want people to buy stuff that they don't need. So I was also deeply bothered by that rhetoric, these big men talking about how we're at war. And I was like, but no, like this narrative is deeply flawed. And it's, again, a cop-out to avoid taking responsibility for what you have done to public health systems and social and other determinants of health too.
Well, it's a deeply, it's a profound misunderstanding of science as well, and how viruses work. Like, it's fucking insane. So let's talk about the necessity of feminism of the 99%. Recognition, compensation, and particularly a solution, the collectivization of reproductive work. So what that would mean.
So the Feminist for the 99% manifesto was written by three authors, Tithi Bhattacharya, Cinzia Arruzza, and Nancy Fraser. And it's a favorite book of mine. I mean, we can share it when we share the interview. And basically the movement of the feminism for the 99% originated with the global feminist strikes that themselves originated in Spain on the 8th of March. And it is kind of taking the tools that were at our disposal and that had been really used by workers in the past and are still being used by workers, but kind of putting a feminist spin on it. And so it's about going on a general strike basically, and it's not only not providing compensated work and not going to work, but it's not just doing but it's also not doing reproductive work, and it's also in some instances going on a sex strike. So it's kind of really stopping any type of labor, whether productive or reproductive or sex, because sex work is work. And using that day, which is usually the 8th of March, except for Switzerland last year, we did it on the 14th of June. But it's using that day to protest and to really highlight, the strikes are articulated around many different axes, and they oftentimes, like the manifestos at the national level, have an intersectional lens, call for, the respect of the rights of migrants, but also talk about high levels of violence against women, dismantling rape culture, respect for women's work, for women's workers as workers, but also to really dismantle any type of gender stereotypes and gender-based discrimination that still plague our societies. And the feminism of the 99% is a feminism that is, by definition, intersectional, but that really looks at countering the mainstream feminist discourse that really centers, again, the experiences of well-off, middle-class, bourgeois, white women in developed or global north countries. And that really just it's not really invested in dismantling structural patterns of discrimination or systems of oppression, but rather to just have more women's representation in these existing patterns. And so it is invested in, breaking the glass ceiling, and equality in pay is something that, of course, we should all aim at being paid the same thing as men, but it doesn't really look at the breakdown of, right, yeah, so women are paid less than men, but then you need to also look at what racialized women, what Black women are earning, what Hispanic women are, what Asian women are earning, as with regards to white women. And that's something that dominant feminist discourse isn't really interested in.
No,
But it's also also refusing to advocate for like more women in the military, or refusing to, that we don't want more women in the military, we don't want more women in the police force, we do not want more representation in already oppressive structures. We want to dismantle all of them. We want to dismantle the police and the army, and we want to dismantle capitalism, and we want to interrogate the impact of capitalism on women and how it is exploiting women. And I think feminism of the 99% is also very invested in looking at the relationship of, yeah, you want to break the glass ceiling as a white, well-off woman who is not, questioning capitalism, but you actually need to look at what are the material conditions that you exist in that are making this possible for you? Who are you outsourcing your reproductive work to? And it more often than not, it's to racialized women who are being exploited to the bone. And you want to work for like multinational companies, but who are the workers who are dying in your multinational companies so that you can make your products? And a lot of women, especially in the textile industry, for instance, it's global South women. And so this is what the feminism of the 99%. And so we're opposing this kind of lean-in feminism that Sheryl Sandberg and other CEOs are advertising. To that, we're opposing the kickback feminism, and we are in deep opposition to that. And we really want to talk about issues of femonationalism, for instance. We really want to have a decolonial perspective to our work, an intersectional lens to our work, and really a feminism that centers the experiences of women from the global South. And I would just say that in terms of the reproductive work, like we're also invested in analyzing that type of work and calling for the collectivization. So it's not just compensation or monetary compensation, but it's the recognition, first of all, that type of work is work. It is labor. Right. And it starts with reproductive justice. It starts with whenever a woman, whether or not a woman has the choice to decide the number and spacing of children, like whether or not she wants to have children, if she wants to have them, being able to access contraceptives, abortions, and respectful maternal health care. And from then on, it's everything that is needed, all the material conditions that are needed for her to be able to have the children that she wants to have, and to parent them in sustainable communities, which is basically the premise of reproductive justice, another concept we owe to Black feminists. And then it's, all the activities that you perform to basically raise the next generation. And so how do you make sure very practically that it's not considered, women's work in the very traditional sense of the term? And for me, it's not enough that, you call on men to do more of that work. Sorry, there's a bit of an echo.
Is there?
Yeah. Okay. It's okay. It's gone.
Did it go away?
It went away. But it's also, how do you actually collect that? How can you, in my ploy to kill the family, how do you collectivize that work?
Right.
And you can do it via, communal laundries, communal kitchens, daycares that are free, not just affordable, that are free,
right.
And that are plenty, so that they are available and they are accessible. And you kind of build a new society where that work is not done by just one woman within the household that is also being exploited to do productive work outside of the home, and so that she has a double and sometimes a triple shifts.
Yeah. It makes me think of how applicable this, so, you and I last time talked about, theories being these lenses that you can put on in order to be able to see the structure within which you live, right? So the architecture that we're in is a patriarchal, capitalist, architecture that has as its sole beneficiary white cisgendered men. That's why we talk about things like looking at things from a decolonizing perspective. That's why we talk about things, looking at things from a Marxist feminist, from a Marxist intersectional, from a 99% perspective, because that then offers, while the challenge is always thinking about, okay, well, it's not always the challenge, but the first thing is seeing. And once you see the architecture within which we're, those of us who are not white men and cisgendered are having to function within, you can't unsee it, right? And from that place, we can start coming up with solutions that all of us have, but we are working within a system that is very committed to not changing. And I think that that's one of the interesting things about the kind of lean in feminism, that again, of course, it's like, you know, men and women should be paid equally. And what I love about the premises that are brought up around Marxist feminism, feminism of the 9%, queer feminism, is this notion that the architecture is set up. And so maybe we just can like not do that and do this over here. And well, before that happens, many things have to fall apart. And I think that the more conversations that we have, the closer we'll get to asking the right questions. But right now, I think we should all, of course, as you always are, Paola, you're so fearless, and you're, you know, what did you say? Like, you show up for a fight, you know what I mean? You're like, I'm fine. And it's like, you know, we have to do this. We have to. Yeah.
And there's this huge tendency in kind of the lean-in feminism and in, you know, even in privilege theory, as opposed to intersectionality, there's really this tendency to have everything go back to the individual, right? So it's, you know, for instance, toxic masculinity is something that men as individuals need to work on. And it's completely divorced, that the conversation becomes completely divorced from patriarchy and from how it is a system of most of the times white cisgender straight men, and it becomes the same, you know, it becomes that it's kind of a moral failure, or it's a personal failure as a woman if you're not doing everything that Sheryl Sandberg, you know, spells out in her book, and that basically it's on you, you know, you have the power to change all of your conditions, and you have the power to make sure that, you know, your work, you know, like you can do like this myth again that you can do things by yourself at the individual level to reach and to change your situation. And I think what the feminism for the 99% is really staunchly against, that it really is against this emphasis on the individual. As you were saying, it's systems that need to change first and foremost, and these systems that need to be dismantled. And I mentioned, you know, collectivization of reproductive work, and I just want to mention the author, I think, that has done beautiful work on this topic, which is Sophie Lewis, and she has published a book called Full Surrogacy Now, and it's brilliant. And I highly recommend reading her, even interviews of her, articles that she's published. That is really such a fresh take, an interesting perspective on what can be done. And it's beautiful the way that she articulates that when we say that we want to get rid of the family, we do not want to get rid of love and kinship and solidarity that are often associated wrongly with the bourgeois heteronormative patriarchal family. On the contrary, we want to sustain that. We want to have these values and these practices blossom between human beings, but it can't be done in structures that are inherently exploitative. You can't have solidarity and love flourish if within your household someone is being exploited. And a lot of the times that someone is women.
Yeah.
Let's go fast. Shut up. I feel like I need to go to a protest. Where's the protest?
Okay, Paola. Thank you so much Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for the work that you do. I am personally so grateful for it, but I just am so grateful for the contribution, for your contributions. We all must. We all must. You know, there's no other way. So I feel really lucky that I get to walk next to you. So thank you for that.
The feeling's mutual. Thank you so much, Casey.
So I'm going to hit stop and then we'll get to say a proper goodbye. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.